So, in today's episode of Learning for Truth and Love, I'm going to share a past webinar that was part of a summation of a project. But in this particular second day of the webinar, what I did was to go far back to look at heritage, because heritage was important to me as well, understanding what cultural assets we brought. But I also realized when it comes to heritage, we can look at it from many different perspectives. Just like here, people of European descendants went far back to look at places in Europe, and you get to learn, both the Italian language, the Spanish language, the French language, the English language, based on people's origins. I wanted to go a little far back to see, you know, what was it in our past, our cultural assets. And I did this in several ways. One of the ways I did this was looking at African rock art through a curriculum that I created called African Rock Art Image Analysis. And this is also based on, I was able to use some of the works, some of the images that was at the British Museum, as well as photographs by David Coulson. And so I wanted to share some of this because, when thinking about heritage and Black heritage and Black representation, this is what it led me to. Now, we could think of heritage in terms of in the United States, right? And you think of origins, and that would take us back to Native Americans who were here. And we can even think of it in terms of the indigenous Africans who were first brought here as well. And or we can also look at the first African Americans here in the United States, very similar to here where European history looks a lot at, American history looks at a lot at the origin and what first Europeans and first European Americans did here. So, uh, as you go through this webinar, I've cut and paste out quite a bit in different parts with different people. So you might even hear me mention someone who was actually there and present at a webinar, or they might show up and ask a question. Participants who were there, attendees, were deleted, and so I skipped over those names. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Also, so one other thing I want to mention is the goal of this particular recording is to just to give you a little glimpse into my thinking and how I combined some of looking at research, combining with science, and thinking about classroom implementation. So hopefully, it gives you some of those insights. So I'm really excited, very thrilled to share some of my work with you. And, the importance of my work here is making sure we have cultural representation of Blacks and that we can go beyond ceremony in including more than scientists, but our narratives and lived experiences. So yesterday I talked about my NSF-funded work, focusing on the narratives and lived experiences of African-American Gullah Geechee. I do want to say that my first publication from this work, Emergent Themes and Pragmatic Research Methods, is out. I'll share the link during the course with you all. And it is available for free download. It's open access. So I will start off by introducing you to my African Rock Art Image Analysis curriculum that I created and started working on before this funding, but I continuously work on it as part of Black representation. Okay. So in talking about African rock art image analysis, when I first began my work on Black representation, I began by attempting to connect our past in Africa with our present here in the United States. And the whole idea here was, how can we learn about our own heritage in a very positive, identity-forming way? How can we learn about our positive cultural resources? And there are many understandings overall that researchers have derived from indigenous people, such as those who've created African rock art. And African rock art has been created by many cultures, including Native Americans and African Americans. And so you'll learn a little bit about that today, about art. So again, when you think about African rock art, it's rock art. It could be painted, which means they're called pictographs, or they can be engraved, which would be petroglyphs. And they're a form of expression and communication from Black African cultures for thousands of years. And even in the United States, there are many people who study the Native American rock art here in the US. Now, so when I first started looking at this, I wrote my first article around 2018 on an interdisciplinary investigation of African rock art images to learn about science, culture, and blending, geology, ethics, history. And so I learned that there was just so much to learn about them. And one of the things scientists were doing quite a bit was exploring the Khoisan Africans. These were indigenous Africans in Africa. And so if you Google them, this is what you come up with. And one of the interesting things about looking at the Khoisan is there were very few instances in scientific text where scientists actually acknowledge and highlight what was learned from indigenous peoples. And so in my article, I highlight an instance by British scientists who worked closely with indigenous Khoisan to learn about their use of secretions from insects as weapons, and also highlighted another instance where pharmaceutical companies and scientists, where they attempted to market and package some of the Khoisan's long-used Hoodia gordoni plant, which and also what was written about them. Now, in the age of technology, the Khoisan, these are images, if you Google, this is what you come up with. They didn't find it flattering. And so they created what's called the Khoisan Code of Ethics. They are the most studied group of Africans. And so they often felt very violated, like people were going into their homes because their homes weren't traditionally the type of homes that we have. And so they were able to also trace what was going on and express. And so one of the videos I highlighted in my publication is looking at what they came up with, the Khoisan, the Code of Ethics. And I wanted to share just 1 or 2 minutes of this clip, just understanding where they're coming from and understanding who they are. I do want to say that the Khoisan of Code of Ethics, even though it was launched, the response of scientists, especially outside of Africa, was that this law didn't extend, within other countries. But there's so much to go in when talking about what we can learn from indigenous Africans. I did create tables in that article that you can use in your class as sources to explore. But the Hoodia gordoni plant was very controversial because, it's a plant that they use as an appetite suppressant to go hunting. But here in the US, pharmaceutical companies attempted to use it as a diet pill. And so, again, with technology, we get to see where our knowledge goes. And so it became controversial and, and so there were just so many other connections to make with African heritage and African rock art. I wanted to highlight this here because I just wanted to give you some of the background understandings before Dr. O'Connell talks about what is ancient art. But there are just many connections to understanding science itself, because African rock art has baffled archaeologists, geologists, chemists, anthropologists, historians. There are so many disciplines here in the Western society that has made, where we've made our earnings and career out of studying African rock art, and especially the Khoisan rock art. And one of the persistent debates has been about dating, whether absolute dating and relative dating was best in determining the age of rock art. And so this is an diagram I created from my article looking at some of the evidence and ideas from archaeologists. And so some think that, absolute dating because it uses chemistry and physics, radioactive dating, you can use spectroscopy to numerically date. And others think, issues came up concerning what are we really dating? Are we dating new art that was created from really old charcoal? Or are we dating old art created from old charcoal? So this is one of the curriculum that I've been working on. I started creating some of the classroom implementations where students can argue back and forth about what would be the best part of dating rock art. And so as part of this, what I did was to create an engage. So I created an engage activity that teachers can use in the classroom to begin an exploration. But the interesting thing about studying them, I mean, this is modern day what Native Americans went through, right? Because it's happening today. Everything that has happened 400 years ago is happening right now. And that's the amazing thing about, the research that I've been doing. I get to see, trace the connections, and, it's, you get to understand what happened then and it's happening now, right? I've decided this summer, I'm going to start, more than one book that I've had, been collecting data on for years, even prior to coming to Howard. One of the things that led me to academia. And I think I finally have the evidence I need to put things all together. And so those are my next steps, to devote that time to, putting together the trends that I see. And mostly I'm ready because I finally figured out what the framework would be to put them all together. But everybody's going to have to wait and see. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're good. All right. So the next part of our program, I'm going to just share some implementations in the classroom related to African rock art image analysis. Usually, it's interesting because one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because I realized in talking about this, I've only shared it with some university settings, and not within not with as many people, or in a conference setting, I should say. And so one of the implementations for the classroom is really asking students, what is African rock art? And looking at what can you tell from a picture? Okay, so I asked the question, what can you tell from a picture? And I've done this with graduate students down to kindergarten students. And some of them have made the same observations. Okay, and so when you look at, I've had kindergarten students notice things that other, even adults wouldn't. For example, some of them noticed the shadow on a rock, and it's amazing the things they've looked at. And some of them said, oh, wow, there's a family there. And so we started talking about, and it also gave me the idea of talking about what is an observation versus an inference, right? So I've created, and I'll share that with you, curriculum examples where students can write down what their observations versus their inferences are. And how do you know something is an observation versus how do you know something is an inference? And so if you go to my website, visibilityinstem.com, and you go to African rock art image analysis, I'm actually in the middle of revamping this. So all of the handouts and slides didn't show up there. You have a slew of images that you can use in your classroom, along with the handouts. So you do have access to this, accompanying handouts. And I think I have I know I have more than one. I'll have to see how many I posted. Okay, and so the handouts I've created can be from different class levels. I have one that you can use with younger students as well, and along with the engaged video and along with a teacher guide. And the nice thing about this is you're looking at science, but you're also looking at literacy, where students are writing their own observations, where students are using science as a way of knowing and as a way of understanding. And, there are the questions that you could ask, especially related to what are some ways you express yourself? What do you do? What materials do you use? And students say, oh, I go to I might go to the supermarket to get, or the store to get crayons. What do you think people did when there weren't any pens, right? When we didn't have crayons, what did they do and how did they make it? And so there's a longer video and a shorter video that they can use, along with guiding questions that you can ask students, and several of the handouts. So I want to get to the exploration part, and I'm going to ask you, if you were to look at some of these rock art images, okay, and you made your observations, what might be some questions you're interested in exploring? So here are some possibilities and some connections that I've made depending on which level. We can do this based on college level or based on elementary level. If we did it on college level, we can ask questions related to, if you're doing a chemistry class, double displacement reactions. In chemistry, one of the things that people have done in chemistry class is use chemistry to generate colors. Okay, so those of you who might have had chemistry, double replacement reactions, where you generate precipitates. A lot of times those precipitates have colors. I see, some question, okay. What pigment stains? Okay, I'll come back to your question. So if you're doing it at an advanced level, here's an example, right? You start with aqueous silver nitrate combined with aqueous sodium chloride. Both, again, you're talking about solutions, and then you get a solid out of it. So here's your chemistry connection. And I wrote a paper on this. It's still under review. So one of the things you can explore is what is the chemistry of African rock art, which I've had students do. Sometimes we've done it, especially even during the pandemic, they explored the chemistry at their kitchen table and exactly what, and even in doing so, when you look at the physical chemistry, when they've been mixing things, and I'll show you some images, you're talking about defining and looking at homogeneous, heterogeneous mixtures. So there's a slew of a whole long list of science connections that you can make and carry out that students can use. And so one of the things that guides this type of chemistry exploration for students is Mary Leakey's work. When she looks at African rock art, that there are three different things that you need in order to create that paint. You need a color, and you need a binder, and you need a liquid. And so as you go through the articles, one of the things I saw and one thing she talked about is these colors might contain crusted ochre or the mineralized or charcoal. And so what I've done, well, I'll show you what I have the image, or you can use a binder, and people have used different things: animal fat, blood, plant juice, or liquid, egg sap, white, and things like egg white. And so I asked, okay, so what would you use as a substitution, right? Because you have these three main components. And so what would you use if you were in a classroom setting? And what do people use today? And it kind of reminds me of your question here. What pigment stains from nature have managed to last into modern day, right? And you mentioned bark, plant berries, absolutely. And ochre is one of those minerals in rocks that are often used to produce color, right? You have black colors, might be, you have different types of clay, coal, and what would be some binders today? And so that's one of the things we did. We literally crushed up limestone, right? Chalk is calcium carbonate, crushed up coal, that would be the black image here. And we use what's the equivalent of plant saps, right? One is chocolate syrup. Another one is we used petroleum, right? Equivalent to, in some ways, equivalent of, you can call them like plant fat, right? Or the equivalent of, I think of applesauce, right? We use applesauce as a binder. And so students actually went and created this. And I've had older students do this and younger students do this as well. And here's my son just in his preschool years. After they created their paint, they went, and I actually got this from another professor who, a teacher who had done this, put paper underneath the tables, and they pretended that they were in a cave and were painting. And so we've done it. We've actually did it at a conference with grad students where they literally got down on the floor and were painting. And so one of the things we do is, I do have a simple handout. I didn't see it earlier, but where students can indicate what might you use as a color, binder, mixture, and really explore and make observations in tables, or it could be simple. For kindergarten, I just put one. And they can use vocab. And what I've done with this is allow students to describe what they observe. And then I give them some vocab. And it was very interesting. I did this with pre-service students to see how it is they vocab changed and how they used it to describe what it is they had already written, knowing that they already wrote it and defined it, but maybe didn't have the vocab. And so I wanted to end this discussion by just kind of binding and combining what Dr. O'Connell had talked about with where one of the reasons, we decided to start talking about this. And a lot of it is, when it comes to our Black African heritage and culture, there are so many things that have come from Black African heritage that we haven't really, that I should say we either haven't acknowledged or we don't necessarily know about or don't realize. And so one of the things that I'm going to share this, one of the research where this all started, actually, even though I haven't fully developed this. There's so much that scientists, archaeologists have been studying that is from African heritage. But when you think about things like this, pottery, we don't often associate it with African or Black heritage. But I love this quote by Christopher Earhart in his book, Civilizations of Africa, A History to 1800. I'm going to read this because for me, I go through looking for what are our cultural heritage, what are our cultural resources that our students should know about. And so he talks about agricultural invention around the Niger-Congo peoples of West Africa. Please forgive my pronunciation here. I'm not a historian, so I'm probably going to not pronounce most of these the way you would. So two key features emerged by around 9500 BCE in the middle parts of the region. The development of a foraging system new to the region, the intensive collection of African wild grains. So he's talking about what they've been doing, such as fonio, and the second earliest solidly dated invention of ceramic technology in world history. The peoples of this region prepare the grains for eating by boiling them in whole grain form in their pots. The archaeologists and archaeobotanists who have studied the key sites of Unjogu along with Bandiagara escarpment of Mali, argue that the inhabitants invented pots specifically for this purpose. The innovation of intensive wild grain collection and the invention of ceramics by the people of the Onjugu culture were, it appears, interconnected components of one historical development. We must conclude for two reasons that women were the inventors of African ceramic technology. To begin with, until the development of commercial pottery making. Everywhere in sub-Saharan African, women were the potters. And so that's part of my work, what I do. I go looking through, and it makes it very hard, all of these historical texts to understand, what it is that people have learned from Black African heritage that people do today and perhaps are not associated with Black African heritage. And how can we highlight and appreciate those cultural resources in a way that we don't today? And so, it's a long, arduous road. I'm going to throw this out there. I wrote a book, To Africa and Back, and the To Africa and Back is the first of a series that I started, realizing that we didn't have as much representative book. But what I do is I combine culture, history, science, and again, just a little bit of the history. But in this book, Cliff, who's the main antagonist in the front here, of course, I'm thinking of my son. I mean, there's part of my son in there. And it's interesting. Anyway, that's another part. But they go exploring African rock art and they stumble upon it in strange places. And, and there's a little bit of mystery in here and the people they meet. So I wanted to highlight that, that's part of what I've done in capitalizing on my research understandings here so that our children can read about it and enjoy an adventurous story with a little bit of fantasy in there that they can read about. Well, I'll go first because one of the things I did do with his class is have them, I started off by, at the time, I printed and laminated the images, right? A bunch of them, and handed out to the students, and they talked about what they observed. Okay, so just to picture what could happen, they talked about what they observed. Amazing observations, and I can tell you, in some cases, they were more observant, than the adults. And then there are gradations. There are gradations in terms of we can start from simple to more complex, where they can write what they observe, right, based on if they can write.
Right.
Creating mixtures where they can, again, that could be simple or complex as well. It could be simple and it involves writing. The other thing I failed to mention is in my list of images, I actually wrote in list of images, I actually have the links to descriptions that scientists and archaeologists have of these based on the observations, based on where they're located. I know you asked me about little kids, but I'm just forgot about that. But, students can do even more complex research about the images if they wanted. And Ms. Worthing, I'm gonna let you speak since you posted something there.
You said geography, and again, like we're looking at maps, and in elementary school, we're talking about what a map is, what it means. We're talking about map keys and even locations, distances. There's so many different ways that you can approach it. Like, again, like Dr. Quinlan said, simple to complex, whatever grade level. But, sometimes the kids provide more to the conversation than you think that they might know. And so really that observation piece and allowing them to kind of guide that discussion is great. So again, science, social studies, engineering, geography, again, whatever you think that your class is going to kind of latch onto. Like one thing I love to do is Google Earth. Pull in Google Earth and literally let them travel from wherever you are, specifically zooming into that space. Because then sometimes you grab other pictures in other different areas as well. So there's a lot that you can do with that.
All right. I love that example. I realized I pinned everybody and didn't pin myself. So yeah, that's a great example. Definitely geography. And it's interesting you said that, because that's exactly one of the reasons I thought about the way I wrote my book, because that's one of the things that our students express quite a bit that's challenging for them, understanding geography and knowing geography in general. I don't think we do enough of it, especially when it comes to looking at geospatial learning and things like that. Anything else? Any other audience questions? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to follow up on the, with younger kids, sort of, I think what Dr. Quinlan, you do with having the kids do the mixtures is just a really great way to get them into it. And something that I find, I don't know how to with kids to adults, but kids, I ask students to draw in my classes and they all think that they're not great artists. And every single one of them, when I ask them a prompt, has the most wonderful things. And I tell them that I'm just going to be really cheesy and tell you all how great your little drawings of foreshortening are, because they really are. So, if they're, just sort of more ways to connect the doing and the drawing and the making with just you enjoy it. That's you're great at it because you are conveying some meaning and, so yeah.
Absolutely. Wow, definitely. I see wrote absolutely developmentally. I'll read what you wrote there. Tactile. The rock art painting was great. The motor skill in primary or not is refined. Absolutely. As Miss Wording said, experiential is awesome. I use butcher bought paper and sticks. Okay. Actually, it's funny you said that. That's another variable too. Because what do you paint with? There weren't brushes back then. Everything is related. Relational, as they are moving toward logic. The first African American woman artist or ceramicist. Connections to early ceramic. Absolutely. Yes. But when you look around the stores, you realize everybody else is making money off of, right? The creation and the marketing of ceramics as a skill, right? Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and like and to receive the next episode. Thank you.